So, some advice from a police officer on how to avoid a speeding ticket or a ticket in general. So, the first advice I can give you, I know this is going to be mind-blowing and it's super complex. Don't break traffic law. It's weird. A traffic infraction, in most cases, is going to get you a citation. And in many cases, it's not a criminal act, although it can be, depending on the severity of what's being done. So let's say that you rolled a stop sign. Let's say that you didn't use your blinker. These are minor things, and I know it's a frustration to get a speeding ticket or whatever, but unpopular truth is if you actually obeyed those traffic laws, that's actually what, not obeying those is actually what causes most traffic accidents and thereby most traffic fatalities. We all know someone who's lost a family member in a traffic accident, and police officers frequently have to work traffic accidents, and it can be quite traumatic when you come up and see a small child that has been killed by the negligence of another driver. So it's a thing. Best advice, obey the law. But if you want the best chance of avoiding a speeding ticket, in my opinion, try to pull over into an environment like I'm driving down a rural road that does not have a good shoulder. Try to pull over as far to the side as you can to leave the officer a place to stand off the side of the road. Believe it or not, one of the most dangerous things that the average police officer does is either A, respond to a domestic where there are two family members or people at least living in the same household who are at odds, if not at blows, and then try to respond there, and you're there to try to get them to stop doing whatever they're doing. And sometimes you'll be attacked by the very person that called you, which is mind-boggling, but it's a thing. Secondly, is one of the second around, if not the most dangerous thing that the average police officer does, is pull a vehicle over on the side of the road. And a lot of it just has to do with the negligence of other drivers. If you just go to YouTube and type in police officer hit by car. So, the officer pulls over a drunk driver, and the officer's trying to prevent the drunk driver from killing someone else, and then is then hit by an inattentive driver, and literally they're dead. Terrible, terrible things that happen like that. So if you pull over far enough to allow the officer to stand off the roadway, it takes a lot of stress off the officer. Secondly, and this is my advice for anyone getting pulled over, is to turn off your radio. If you have sunglasses on or a hat, a lot of people that are wanted, that are criminal, that are about to do something bad, and they don't want to be identified on a body camera because they're going to try to assault or murder the officer, they will be wearing a hat and or sunglasses. They'll do something to disguise their appearance, try to avoid eye contact. If you turn off your radio, if you take off your hat and sunglasses if you're wearing them, if it's at night, turn on the dome light. I taught my son how to get pulled over and turn on your dome light at night, and don't be making lunging movements. Is something I can talk about in a minute, because that's what people do right before they grab a weapon. We'll come back to that. If you have slightly tinted windows, or if it's at night, if you roll down the back window enough for an officer to see in, and if you want to only roll down your window enough to be able to hand out a driver's license and proof of insurance, that's fine. That's fine. I understand that. But if you roll down the back window enough, it helps the officer to see that there's no threat in the back seat. So the more stress you can take off of an officer, the better in that moment. I'm just being honest with you. And coming back to lunging movements, I was working tandem with an officer. There were two of us in the same vehicle, which is not common in my area. Budgetarily, I was volunteering my time. Budgetarily, it's a non-starter for a lot of smaller communities and poorer counties. And so this gentleman jumped out of his vehicle. Well, let's think about that. You're stressed because you got pulled over. Totally get it. You don't want to get a ticket. It's going to hit you fiscally. It's going to cost you. I get it. But jumping out of the vehicle suddenly and throwing your hand up that you've got the registration you were looking for, or you've got the proof of insurance, better to roll the window down and hold up the item, or hold up a hand and wave, and they'll come back to you. In many states, like in my state, it's a requirement for us to issue a ticket if the person cannot produce proof of insurance. But if you go to your court date, which you better, because if you don't, you'll get a bench warrant from the judge. But when you go to your court date and you prove that you had insurance, you just didn't have the paperwork on you, it's just dismissed. They dismiss the ticket. Now, if you don't have insurance and you get the insurance later, most of the time they don't dismiss the ticket. So that we're clear. So that's absolutely a thing. And so if you can take those stressors off of the officer, number one. Number two, if you are in that situation, don't make sudden lunging movements, just because that's exactly what bad guys do. So this guy jumped out of his vehicle, and I was out the side of the vehicle. The officer that I was working with was finishing up looking him up and getting his details, and I came out the side of the vehicle very quickly because I don't know what we're dealing with. And the guy kind of realized, oh, I did that very suddenly. Well, your adrenaline's up. You're experiencing stress. That makes us sometimes make really quick movements. Just, keep breathing. Breathe smoothly and steadily in and out. That is a healthy way to do that. It provides more oxygen to the brain. The more oxygen and blood flow can reach the brain, the better. And that helps us to be calmer. A lot of times people, when they're shook up, I have had more people rattle off their date of birth to me indecipherably, or their social, and blah, 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 and it'll be just like that. And then they get more perturbed when you say, I'm sorry, I'm not quite that quick. And I had to ask one young man that he had done some pretty bad stuff, and he was very shook up because he realized that what he did was about to have consequences. And as we were talking, it was terroristic threatening of another individual. And so as we were talking to him, and he was very, very shook up, I said, hey, this will help you if you're able to breathe in, hold it for 2 or 3 seconds, and then breathe out in through the nose, out through the mouth. I promise it'll help. He did. It totally helped. We call it tactical breathing. There's several other terms for it. So if you are able to communicate anything that you need to as calmly as possible, that'll not only help you, but not making those sudden movements. And it is one of those things that gets your attention when you're standing at the side of a vehicle and somebody suddenly lunges for their glove box. Really gets your attention. You're like, whoa, what are we doing here? And that's how most bad guys, when they're about to do something really, really terrible, they don't very slowly do it. They want that element of surprise. And so that's another thing. And then I'm not going to ask you to admit to guilt. Now, I will tell you, the more honest somebody is with me, my personal opinion, lawyers will tell you don't ever admit to anything. Well, that's their job. I get it. And I respect that. I have friends, believe it or not, that are lawyers. But the more honest someone is with me, the more I appreciate it. And so if somebody's like, you know what, I'll be honest with you, I wasn't paying attention, and I'm sorry I was doing whatever it was I was doing, I appreciate it, and I'm actually much less likely, and I know many, many officers that are much less likely to issue a ticket. But if you're wanting to avoid a ticket, in many cases, you've got your paperwork. I actually keep a clip up in my visor that has my proof of insurance, and by the time the officers got to the vehicle, I have everything down. This is something I do as an officer, and something I did for years before I went into law enforcement. Is I will have that material handy, and then I can reach up into an area that they can see, and I'm not having to dig through things. And that's a thing that helps. So the more comfortable the officer can feel in the moment, the better. And in most states, it is a requirement that you identify yourself. So when people don't want to identify, it raises red flags. And a lot of times the people fleeing justice that have murdered somebody or committed some other heinous crime, they don't want to identify. And unfortunately, in order to issue a citation or identify the person in the vehicle, you kind of have to be able to ID them. So the more cooperative in that regard, the better. And in some states, refusal to identify is actually grounds to be transported to jail, to be fingerprinted, and then identified. And so then you've dealt with all of that when it's just a matter of, hey, I didn't see that stop sign, officer. I am so sorry. And that is on me. And then identifying yourself, and then they run you. And most of the time, and I've worked with a lot of officers over the years, most of the time, if you're not a habitual speeder or whatever, you don't have a massive history of those things. A lot of departments actually prefer to issue first-time warnings. So if they see that you don't have a long history, and if they see that you have not been recently given a warning, some departments' computer systems can actually list all of that, and or share it with other departments in their area. It just depends on their computer system and what they do. But in result of all of that, if they see that you don't have a history and you haven't been recently given warnings for the same, they let you go. Most officers are looking for drugs and warrants. They're looking to get bad people off the street. They're not concerned about grandma and the fact that she didn't use her blinker to turn left, that sort of thing. So hopefully those thoughts help. The more polite, the better. My son actually got out of a couple of speeding tickets that he deserved because I had taught him to be respectful. Yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. And when he was significantly, let's just say significantly over the speed limit, and this was before I was in law enforcement, but I was doing the chaplain thing for law enforcement. Both times that he was pulled over, the amount of things he did in advance, just not jumping around, just had the dome light on, had the window down, had it. He actually, I taught my son to take the keys out of the ignition and lay him up on the dash. It shows that you're not intending to flee at all. He was forthright with his proof of insurance and everything else. And they came back and they're like, honestly, I should have written you that. I should have written you a ticket. And my son knows better than to name drop. I despise that. And so he didn't try to name drop, oh, my dad's the chaplain for the, no. And so the officer came back and said, I'm going to let you go with a warning. Don't speed through my town again. And that is something, first off, obey the law. But secondly, if you're given a warning, realize what it is and try to honor it, because a lot of times the second time around, you are going to get a ticket. So give them a wide amount of room to pull off the road. If there's not a safe environment, I want to circle back to that for just a moment. I got pulled over in a town that is nothing but twists and turns, and there's no shoulder, and I think I had a taillight out. It was something like that, a brake light or tail light out. It was something pretty minor. Most departments just use that as a way to make contact with you, give you, a warning, say, hey, just to let you know. That way, you don't come out one day and get rear-ended because both of your brake lights are out and you don't know it. It's prevention of accidents, and that happens. I literally have encountered people where both of their brake lights are out, or both of their taillights are out, and they get rear-ended. That's absolutely a thing. But I put my hazards on, I buzzed the window down on the driver's side, and I motioned up the hill, and I knew that there was ahead of me, there was going to be a side street I could turn off of. So I turned off of it. It was a very short cul-de-sac, and I had motioned to the guy, and he gives me a huge nod like, yes, thank you. And so it was a very small cul-de-sac. I looped back around to where it was very well lit. We were under a street light in that case. You may not have that opportunity. But I didn't go for 4 miles, and I put my hazards on and what have you to let him know, and indicated with my body language in the window what I was doing. He was very thankful. And he said, man, I wish more people would do that. He's like, so many people stop in places that are very, very dangerous, and they don't seem to think about it. And a lot of it's just nervousness. People are genuinely afraid in those moments, like, oh crud, what have I done? Or I know darn well what I did, and they go to pull over. And some people do it in a malicious sense. They pull over deliberately in an environment that puts the officer at risk. And that's not just a jerk move, but how do you feel about living with the death of another human being on your conscience? Because that would bother me. That's a thing. But if you pull over into an environment like that, like I was recently working with one of my departments, and an individual, a woman, was significantly speeding, and she decided in that state, the requirement is that you pull to the right side of the road. I don't know any states that have a different requirement, but in that state it's specific. You pull to the right-hand side of the road off as far as you can safely for your safety and the safety of the officer, because there are many inattentive drivers out there. Distracted drivers kill a lot of people every year. And so she decided to pull across the road into a driveway that ended rapidly in a gate. It was just this little strip of gravel that butted up to a gate, and so there was barely room for her to pull off, and zero room. Now, thankfully, this was a rural road, and although there's a steady stream of traffic, there was not a wall of traffic. And because the officer needs to pull in behind the vehicle they pull over, the officer had to pull in behind her, which blocked part of that lane. I mean, she created a significant danger. And then she told the officer, she's like, well, the way you pulled me over was really dangerous. And he looks at her, completely calm and collected, had himself together, and he's like, well, ma'am, this state requires, when you are pulled over, to pull to the right as far as you safely can. And she kind of made a face. She created an unnecessary danger in that environment for that officer and herself, with what she did, and actually could have been cited for it. But how you conduct yourself, leaving the officer room, and then the politeness that you speak to the officer. I'm not saying kiss up, but if you start off with an attitude and you may literally turn. I mean, to me, ethically, you should probably know as an officer when you pull somebody over whether you intend to give them a ticket or not by the time you get to the window. But I have seen people be absolute horses patooties to the degree that the officer was like, I honestly was not going to write you. You failed to maintain your lane. You've got a tail light out. Your tag light isn't functioning. You have a busted windshield. You're only displaying one license plate. You were exceeding the speed limit, and you have no proof of insurance. So now I'm going to give you 4 to 8 tickets. I mean, I've seen people that were such royal horses patooties, and I mean, unfortunately, that is an element of our society that they literally make their own situation worse. I know of a gentleman that was such a turd during a traffic stop that he had a non-extradition warrant, which meant that in the jurisdiction that he was in, the one that we were working, that he would not be arrested. He would only be arrested in the jurisdiction he had committed the crime, which was an adjacent county. And so in the course of this, he was such a jerk that the officer came back and sat in the vehicle, and he goes, I don't normally do this, but this guy is doing everything in his power to provoke me. And he says, so I'm going to call my supervisor and ask permission to transport him to that neighboring county, to their jail. And so he called the boss, and the boss listened to the details and goes, yeah, I think this needs to happen. And so from there, they contacted that jurisdiction, who said, please and thank you, please bring him to us. And so his arrest was effected. He was placed in the back of the vehicle, and I think he learned a lesson, because unfortunately some lessons, it's necessary for them to cost, and sometimes people need a lesson to sting, and that's an unpopular truth, and I'm sorry, but that's why speeding tickets exist. Is if you've ever had to work a fatality, which most people have not. Most people will never see a dead body in their entire life unless it's in a funeral home. If you've never worked a fatality that was completely preventable, and or it especially involves a woman or a child, those are particularly heartbreaking and traumatic. When you encounter somebody that's CNI driving, doing something truly dangerous, and with blatant, wanton disregard for the safety of not only themselves but others, it you have a very visceral reaction as a person to it. It's horrible to see people do those things, and those things get people tickets. And in this case, this young man turned what was probably going to be a warning into a night in the clink in another jurisdiction. So how we conduct ourselves as people is very important. And I have literally seen officers where they were perturbed with somebody, and there's an old passage in Proverbs, in the book of Proverbs, a gentle answer turneth away wrath. I have seen officers who have started off perturbed with somebody, but just by the way the person conducted themselves and said, hey, I apologize, here's all my information, and even without admission of guilt, the officers come back and actually said, you know what, I started that stop off on the wrong foot, and I actually expected you to be completely different than you are, the way that you've acted. So I'm going to, against my better judgment, let you go with a warning. So hopefully that helps you, but your best bet is just obey the law. God bless. Have a great day.